Alright guys, good evening. I'm actually recording this on the same day that I recorded the first week clinicals, or the last bit of the first week clinicals video, right? About to go get some sushi with my lady, but I wanted to get this video off my chest first. It's nothing terribly deep. I just kind of wanted to give three scriptures that I think really speak some advice to people that are trying to go through, trying to get through a medical program, contemplating if they even can get through a medical program, or maybe for a fact that God's called you down, not even just the medical path. I'm going to be talking I'm going to be talking from that perspective, but just called you down a path in life, like a career path or something, where you're just worried about, God's provision, that sort of thing. Just three scriptures to think about, and then sushi for me. So, let's get into it. Proverbs chapter 10, verses 3, 4, and 5. All right, what does it say? It says, "The Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, but he thwarts the craving of the wicked. A slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. He who gathers in summer is a prudent son, but he who sleeps in harvest is a son who brings shame." All right, we're going to be talking about, this video is kind of just a meditation on the combination of God's provision and your effort, how the two meet and work together, not how they butt heads and work against each other, like, sometimes people younger in the faith tend to think. All right, the Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, right? Just as a basic principle, not saying there aren't times where you're not going to have food, whether that's, a consequence of persecution or whatever, but that's, your sacrifice for the Lord. That's just what you're doing to hold on to Jesus, right? But just the heart of God towards his people is provision. That's what it is. Doesn't always look the way you want it to look, but it is provision, right? But think about the verse that's connected to that, right? Verse 3 starts off saying, "The Lord doesn't let the righteous go hungry," right? Who's the active one in that verse? The Lord. He's the one actively not letting the righteous go hungry. But what about in verse 4? It tells us a slack hand causes poverty. So in the case of poverty, what's the causal link? Not all the time, but, in what Proverbs is trying to say here, a slack hand. The Lord doesn't have slack hands, that's us, right? How could it be that the Lord doesn't let the righteous go hungry, but a slack hand causes poverty? Well, because the Spirit of Christ in you should really start driving out, those things of laziness, those things that cause a slack hand within you, right? Paul would even tell the Thessalonians as much to, admonish Christian brothers that just weren't working at all. Like, that's not how God is, so if you're going to represent him, you got to have diligent hands. But the amazing thing here is, again, it's the Lord. It's not letting the righteous go hungry, right? The Lord is providing for you through you, right? Which is, I think, a really big just peace of mind, right? It's the opposite of the American dream, thinking that, I can pull myself up by my own bootstraps. It's actually a humility in recognizing in and of myself, I wrecked my life, right? I needed the blood of God's Son to fix me. And some days I'm still a hot mess, right? It's the humility to recognize that God is so good. God's so good at what he does that he can take a wreck like you and turn your hands into diligent hands and then provide for you through you, which for a lot of us, if we're just being honest, is probably one of the biggest miracles God could actually do, right? It's parting a sea, there's getting you off drugs, and then there's making you sustainable, right? It's crazy. It's a crazy miracle, but it is what he does, right? So that's just kind of the first foundation stone there, right? The Lord doesn't let the righteous go hungry, right? A slack hand causes poverty. God, by his grace, if you choose to work with it, will remove your slack hand and therefore provide for you through these hands that he created, right? So in a very real sense, you got this as long as you follow him. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 7. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. And whatever you get insight. Right? Now, in a Christophonic sense, this is talking about Jesus, right? The beginning of wisdom is getting wisdom. It's having eyes that are able to see, ears that are able to hear, and getting insight on what you're hearing, right? Check the parable of the soils for a Christophonic application of this, right? The practical application of this is, if you don't know something, find out how to do it, right? I mean, like, I'm not even at the end of the path that God has for me in medicine, and I've learned that lesson tenfold, man. Like, if you don't know something, that's okay, because it was never your job to know everything anyway, right? If you're ever struck with fear at the fact that, oh, I don't know how to progress down this point, or in my meticulous planning, I did not consider this aspect of things, just calm yourself, right? Woosah, remember that God knows everything about the path that he called you down, and he called you down it anyway, right? Which means that for your current conundrum, whatever it is, there is an answer, right? So go get the answer, right? If you need wisdom, go get wisdom, right? You got access to the God of all wisdom, who gives it liberally to those who ask in faith, not wavering. Who's that? James, right? Should probably go look that up. Luke chapter 12, verses 13 to 34, right? Starts off with the parable of the rich fool, and it leads into Jesus talking about not being anxious, right? Do not be anxious about your life, says Jesus, what you'll eat, nor about your body, what you'll put on, for life is more than food, and the body more than clothing, right? As amazing as whatever it is that God's called you to do, right? As far as your vocation is concerned, whether it's medicine, engineering, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, you know who you are if you watch this, whatever your career path is, right? Remember that that's just a crown to take off your head and lay at the feet of Jesus when your race is finished, right? Like, for eternity, I'm not going to be glorying in the fact that, I was doing maintenance on people's lungs for eternity, right? I mean, might be some good memories to pull from there, sure, right? But like, the highs of this life that will be remembered are the ones that were done for Jesus and faith. And at the end of the day, your identity is found not in whether or not you successfully manage to, live out your vocational calling, because secret, nobody did and nobody will, right? Like, even the people that you deem as successful haven't done everything that God wanted them to do in their vocation, just chances, When your race is done, when you stand before him, just like the man in the parable of the rich fool, right? This night your soul is required of you, and all the things you've prepared, whose will they be? Whose will they be? If they weren't God's from the start and stayed God's the whole time, that's going to be a tough day, But if you understand that it was always in his hand, that's a conversation you probably won't even have to have on Judgment Day, right? When it's all said and done. Right? Don't find your identity in, I mean, it sounds weird, right? But like, don't find the base of your identity in the work that God's called you to do, right? The base of your identity is found in the work that Jesus did for you, right? It's very easy to get those two things mixed up. Second thing about this that I want you to consider is what Jesus tells us to consider. He tells us to consider the ravens. Why? They don't sow, they don't reap. They don't have a storehouse nor a barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? And if you're not able to do as small a thing as that, why be anxious about the rest? Right? God takes care of the birds. But I want you to consider something, right? Next time you're ever up early enough to see the birds, look at how they get their sustenance, right? Do they just sit in their nests and wait for worms to just be airdropped into the nest? Nah. Even the birds work. Even the birds that God takes care of, that Jesus says God personally feeds, even those birds work. What does that tell us? Well, it brings us back to where we started in Proverbs, right? God provides for his people. Heck, God provides for his creation through the diligent hands that he graciously gives them. Right? So, like, sit on that, meditate on that, and when, not if, but when the Spirit of God has given you some confidence on that, start taking some practical steps, you know? If you got to research, some colleges that are going to give you, some education in the field you want to go into, then start doing some Googling, Maybe grab that cell phone, call up there, drive up there. My preference is talking to people in person because, as my wife can tell you, paperwork is my Achilles heel, and you cannot discuss that with me over the phone or I will confuse it. So, do some legwork, drive up there, If you got to talk to someone who's walked this path for you, walk that path, If you need some money, work. Scholarships, financial aid, Don't be too prideful to take the provision that God's given you just because it's obviously grace, right? Even the provision that you worked for was grace. It was probably just a bit more subtle grace, but it was grace all the same, right? So, just consider those three things, man. There's more to say than that, but those three just wanted to get off my chest for anyone that needs some encouragement to, to get off their butt. Not so much because they're lazy, but because they're maybe lazy and also underneath the laziness, afraid of even getting started and afraid that God won't have your back. Well, he does, and he will. But you got to start applying the Spirit of grace to these hands to keep them diligent, right? So, until next time, man. Peace. Sushi time for me.